Hello everyone, today we're going to have a look at Game Creator components. We'll cover the core and the additional official modules as well. Before we get started, I'd like to thank all of my Patreon supporters for the absolutely amazing support. Now we're going to have a look at all of the components the core Game Creator has, which is definitely going to be the biggest chunk of this video. Additionally, we'll also check out the additional components that are added with the official modules. And there's a couple of interesting ones with Core Game Creator I didn't actually notice before making this video. I haven't even tested some of these and it's definitely interesting. So let's get started. So with Game Creator, there are several ways to add components to your scene. And the most common way would be to create a game object and add the component this way. And you'll have a list of all of components, everything included into Unity and other assets as well. Now Game Creator does make it a bit easier for most of the game components that are used. You can right click in your hierarchy, go to Game Creator and add the components. Now we have variables here as well, which I'm not going to cover because I did a separate video on that already a couple of weeks ago. I'll put the link in the description for that if you're interested in variables. They are key to any game project if you are using Game Creator, so definitely recommend reading a bit more about it or watching the video if you want to learn how all of that works. Now I'll be starting off with the most common game objects and game components that we will be using. So let me add all of them and explain how they work and explain how they actually all work together. Now the actions is what you dictate for something to happen. So for example, we could have an action and basically pressing action, add action here, pulls up a list of all of the actions that all modules, including unofficial modules, will add to your project. So we can add an action here for object, and let's just do a simple one, change tag. I'm going to drag in my plane here from the scene, and the new one will be tag will be enemy. Now the default tag of this object is untagged, and this basically is an action saying, okay, I want to change this object into to be tagged with enemy. Now something needs to trigger these actions, but we can also have conditions so that they would only trigger if a certain condition is met. So we have we could literally just on start, press this little plus here and drag in the actions, and that's how it would trigger. And we'll cover the trigger component in a little bit more, but basically by default it's set to on start. And if I press play now, then on start, if I inspect this object, suddenly the tag is now enemy. When I close play mode, it's back to untagged. So really plain and simple. But what if I only want this to trigger if it meets a certain condition? So this is the condition component, and in the condition component you can add a clause. So I will drag in the actions I had before, and you will see that it will do this if this condition would be met. Now right now we don't have a condition, and the condition can be something really simple. So we'll grab game object again, we'll drag in the same plane. So if the plane is active, then it will change its tag. And now when I go back to my trigger, I'm going to remove this one, select the little plus again, and I'm going to press on this little icon, and now I can drag in a condition. And there we go. So now it will check once the scene starts, is this condition met? So is the object active? Then yes, it will basically trigger this action. And that's pretty much all of the basic logic for Game Creator. Most of your sequence of events will be happening with these three components. So we have a trigger component, condition component, and action component. Now the trigger component is one of the most important ones as well, of course, because without a trigger nothing will actually happen. Now when you add, and I'm going to remove this for a moment, when you add a trigger the way, via the hierarchy like this, you will see that it has a collider. Now most of the time this collider is not needed, so I'm going to remove it right now. And as you see, it will work the same way, nothing changes. So why does the collider get added once you add a trigger component this way? It's because some of them do require you to have a collider. So if I look up play or enter, I will get a warning. This type of trigger requires a collider. Select from below, and we'll have sphere, box, capsule, and mesh. So I can press sphere again, and it's back. We automatically add our collider component. Now you manually need to set this to trigger, of course, and that's it. Now if you didn't set up, so I'm going to remove my condition components and my action components. If you didn't set these up, you can actually add them here straight away. So we can add a condition or a action, because you can have multiple spawning of one trigger as well, and now they will become childs of this game object, so children of this game object. And that's it. That's the easiest way to actually add these components and what these components actually do. Yes, you can always manually add them like this as well, but it's not faster, so not a recommendation to take this approach. So that's it for the actions conditions. Now with the triggers, there's a bunch of triggers here. So basically different use cases as to when these conditions or actions would actually trigger. And yes, once you add more modules, you will also have more triggers. So pretty cool. I'm going to remove them for now. Then the next really important component with Game Creator is the camera motor. Now you can add it like this, and I do want to highlight something first. So if we go to our main camera, you will see that this is everything that is listed by default. Now Game Creator does need a couple of additional components, and luckily once we add a camera motor, they automatically are added to the main camera. So you will see hook, camera, and camera controller. So yeah, really cool. This is something really nice. And basically what these components do, so hook camera is used to identify the camera being used with a camera motor, and the camera controller component allows you to select which camera motor is used by default. So if you would create a new one, you can literally just drag that in and this will be the new one. These settings are pretty plain and simple. This is the position and rotation duration set to pretty low. This allows for a bit of a smoothing effect. If you are using a first-person camera, I'd recommend changing these to 0 most of the time to avoid any clipping. So you know what I mean once you start using it. So I'm going to remove this additional one, going to drag this one back in here, and we're going to have a look at the actual camera motor component. So the camera motor component has a bunch of options here. The most important one, if this is your default one, is to select is main camera motor. Now this is not necessary, but it allows you to quickly change camera motors as well with actions without having to identify what the main camera motor is constantly. So pretty useful, especially if you are using actions like that in a prefab, where you cannot, actually select something from the scene. Anyway, let's dive into this a bit. So the adventure camera is the default third-person camera, and this can be used for characters or even cars if you wanted to. You have a bunch of different options to customize this. I'm not going to go in depth on that, but that's basically what it does. The first-person camera is, well, as the name suggests, first person. Bunch of options here as well. And then we have a fixed camera, so think, for example, for a map overview, a main menu, or the perspective of a camera being used in game, for example, so a security camera. Then we also have the follow camera, which is mostly used for top-down perspectives, where it tracks the player and you can set an offset for a top-down view. And same for side scrollers, by the way. Then we have railway, target, tween, and orbit, and all of these, well, ignore the orbit, that's actually a custom one. We have these, and all of these custom ones, all of these camera motors are used for mainly cutscenes or things like that. So that's it for the camera motor. I'm going to leave this and I'm going to set it to adventure camera just for the default, so we can cover everything else. We have the following really important components as well, and they are being used for a player and a character. And basically this is a combination of components. So on the player we have, so let me collapse all of this. We have 4 default components set, and we'll go over them in a bit. And on the character we have 3 components. Now the first 2 in this case, so the character controller is actually not a game creator one, this is a Unity object. And this allows you to, well, as you can see, set the collision as well for the character. Same for the player. One big difference, as you can see, is that the radius by default for the player is set to 0.2. This also serves as the hitbox, for example, if you're using shooter and melee, so it's quite important. Now the height of this can be set to, should be set by default actually to these values to more match, or something like this, to actually match the height of the character model a bit better. Because one of the important things to keep in mind with the character controller is, like I said, this is the hitbox. So if this sticks out above the head and you have a wall here, but this actually sticks out, they can literally still hit you with the shooter module, for example. So yeah, quite important little thing. Also, if you are going to be crouching, you need to use the character property action to adjust the character controller height and positioning as well, in order to make sure that it doesn't stick out by default, because that's one of the things. By default, just using a crouch animation doesn't change the character controller size. And as this is your hitbox, and also used by the behavior model with perception in order to track the player. So yeah, it's quite important that you adjust this size as well. So that's it with the character controller. Now the important part here is the hook player, and this component allows game creator to identify what the player controller is. Yes, that technically means you could add this to non-game creator character controllers as well, for example for VR ones, and it would still allow game creator to recognize it as a player. Now, don't think it's some magical solution which will allow you to use any random character controller with game creator and it will fully functionally work with everything, including the other modules. It won't. But with a bit of extra work, it does allow you to use character controllers that are not game creators' own, with some limited functionality. Just don't count on using the additional modules too much for that. So let's continue with the player character components, and compared to the character components, the only real difference is that the character component doesn't have any player input, which makes sense because it's not a player. The basic parameters, which all can be modified with actions as well, are, well, the basic ones. Is this player controllable? Can he run? At which speeds? Can he fall, run, jump, etc.? Then we have the advanced parameters, and this is actually quite important and often forgotten about. Is by default this is set to movement direction, and that's a traditional third person look. You can move around, and just because I will now change like this doesn't mean that the camera will straight away follow, but it also means that you don't see any animations for walking backwards, where you're just turning around, and you don't see any animations for walking sideways. Now, if we use camera direction instead, which I will do now, you will see that we can now walk sideways, we can walk backwards, and we have to use the mouse to basically turn around. And yeah, that's actually really cool as well. Some games use this in third person. If you are going with a first person camera, you should most definitely do this. This also means that this is why in third person this is a little less interesting by default. As you can see, I just turn the mouse and we glide over the floor like this. So some animations for that would be nice. But yeah, so quite important little thing. Then we have target, and these are really specific use cases. Can use navigation mesh. Pretty simple for NPCs. You would always turn this on if you are using nav mesh for your plane. And navigation mesh basically dictates where you can walk, yes or no. So they wouldn't run into walls. Why would you want this for your player? Well, if you are going with a different type of input, say point and click for example, you would actually rely on the navigation mesh to dictate where you can walk as well. So yeah, pretty important. And we have save load, so does it save these parameters, yes or no? Player inputs, well, I already addressed this, but basically it gives us a couple of options. So point and click, like in Diablo, directional, which is the default, follow pointer, side scrolling, and tank control, which I don't really use. Then we have your default jump keys and acceleration. Now acceleration is something that not everyone fully comprehends, so I'll quickly show what it is. So if I would lightly press the key to go up, forward, you will see that I'm gliding over the floor a tiny little bit, and again, not that much. But yeah, anyway, it's even hard to simulate because it hardly ever happens. But yeah, you could basically glide a bit. Now if I turn this off, there's literally no difference. So if I press, I literally go into the run animation straight away. And yeah, so that's what acceleration does. It kind of smooths, the going from idle to run straight away. You can adjust these parameters. Character animator is really important and one of the best components by default in Game Creator, really. For one, you can simply drag in a random character model, so let's drag one and just pull it in here, and this is now my new character. And if I hit play, this has become my new character. And that's it. That's all you have to do. We can revert it back to the default one or change to the FPS one, which just doesn't have a head. Oh, in inverse kinematics, this is one of the most important things, and you see this a lot, being used a lot recently. And the great thing is we can toggle these off and on with actions as well. So I'll go into play mode and highlight the most important one, which is foot IK. So if I go to scene now, this is what foot IK does. It makes sure you actually adjust to your to the terrain. So the player recognizes this as terrain, and if I mess around with this a bit, you will see that the feet adjust to it, and they will also adjust in angles, etc., etc. If I turn this off, well, it just basically won't. So there's no adjusting for the terrain whatsoever. So yeah, really cool, really useful. Foot elevate allows us to basically adjust the position of the feet, in plus and in minus. And the reason you'd use this is, for example, for custom animations that you'll most likely use. A lot of them actually have the player hover above the ground a bit, which is due to the skin width. And if you are using animations from the same packs, this is a quick way to basically make sure the player is no longer hovering above the ground. This is completely new. It was added with the last Game Creator update, and I'm really, really happy with it because honestly it's pretty awesome. Hand IK can be used for a couple of actions, so you don't actually have to animate, and you can use IK to basically point, have the player use his hand to push a door, push a button, without having to animate this. Really cool. Not used that much, but really cool, and you know, there's a lot of potential in actually using that. Let me remove the character because we don't need this one anymore. Then we have SmartHeadik, and this is a blessing and curse at the same time. Luckily, you know, you can toggle it on and off with actions, so that's absolutely great. But SmartHeadik has some advantages and some, you know, lesser things. So, you know, if I move around right now, you will see the head, you know, track basically where the, you know, the camera is directing. If I turn this off, it will not do this. You know, the head, as you can see, doesn't move around, and that's because it will literally just use the animations used for the head, and that's it. Yes, that also means that if you have it turned on, any animations you have on the head will not be used or displayed. So for example, with traversal, it's recommended to turn it off, but you can just do that with actions. There's another incredibly cool use case for SmartHeadik, which I'll show in a bit as well. And then we have ragdoll, which, you know, allows you to ragdoll the character. So if he's being hit, or you know, if he dies, you can set the mask for the character, the timeout, and the getting up and down animations. So yeah, pretty cool. Now the next component I'm showing is actually related to that head IK, which is Hotspot. And Hotspot is something I never really used that much, and it's a shame because it's actually really cool. Especially for you know, cutscenes, those interactive moments in games where you will have this button appear, press B to, you know, look at events happening, blah blah blah. So if I turn this on and I add a little plus, so you know, this is the point we're tracking, and this is the hotspot, this is the radius. If the player enters this, he will use head IK to look at that point. So let me demonstrate this. So, you know, right now, as you can see, the player is looking at, well, right now an invisible object, but it's a really cool way to actually show in a game, you know, when something important happens, or, you know, if it's an object the player should be looking at or pick up. If I go into the scene mode and I actually, you know, move this around, you will see that the player is actually tracking, you know, this object. And that's one of the really cool things with head IK, you know, SmartHeadik, is that we can do things like that. And as you can see, we're moving, you know, the head is moving around, and we don't have to create animations for that. So, you know, inverse kinematics are awesome. So yeah, really cool. And, you know, straight away that actually discusses the hotspot component, and that's what the hotspot component does. You have a couple of options to customize this as well. Add a, you know, a hint like, you know, oh, this is interesting. If he walks past an object, he should be picking up. So yeah, really cool. Can adjust a couple of things. And that's the hotspot component. Now, another really important one for game creator is the marker component. And what does the marker component really do? It literally is just a marker dictating where you could instantiate something, or the player has to walk to, and it's completely built in with game creator, so it's actually used well. And one of the nice things is, I'm going to put this here, is that if you check in game mode, it's invisible. You can't actually see it, so it's only visible you know, in your scene mode, which is really, really nice. It has a stop threshold as well, so you don't actually have to get to the center of it, which can be set with actions as well. So yeah, really cool stuff, incredibly useful, and basically it just, you know, creates a point where you have to walk to, or you can instantiate something on top of. So good stuff. No collider, which you can add yourself if you want to, but by default there isn't one, which is what makes this an interesting object. Then we have a couple of really interesting ones that I can't find here, and maybe I'm using them wrong. I've actually never seen them before, so you know, it's pretty interesting. But while preparing for this video, I actually went into everything that's available, and I found the following: remember, and remember active, and remember transform. And these are, when you look up where the script is housed, it's related to saving and loading. I haven't tested this, I haven't tried this, I've never actually seen these before, and it would be cool to check if we can add this component to, objects, and if it would actually store their position, rotation, scale, or if they are active, inactive, or destroyed, just based on that without having to use variables. I haven't tested it out yet, so if you have, please let me know in the comments. But yeah, it seems interesting, and it's strange that after all this time I'm finding new components I've never actually seen before. So that's pretty much it for all of the default components. Now we only have one thing left, and those are the UI components. And the Game Creator UI components are variations of all the default UI components used by Unity itself, and they are simply adjusted for Game Creator. So as you can see, this is a slightly different button, and it has, instead of events, you have Game Creator actions. And yeah, the same can be said for all of the other ones. So I'll just pick a random one slider, for example. We suddenly have the option to store values in variables, or change things related to variables as well. So yeah, it's really cool stuff. Um, if you are going to use Game Creator for your project and are creating your UI, it's actually incredibly useful to use the customized, Game Creator UI buttons, sliders, and toggles. So cool stuff. So that's it for Game Creator Core. Now let's head over to all of the additional modules. So let's have a look at the additional components, and as you can see, a lot of them don't actually appear here. So I have shooter, melee installed, and I'm not really seeing anything here. We have a couple of them. So inventory has a single one, which is a container, and other than that, we have a dialogue component here. So let's actually start off with that. So the dialogue component is literally the component that houses all of your dialogue if you are using the dialogue module, allowing you to add conversations, choices, which can again include actions and conditions, have proper settings. For one component, it's actually incredibly fully packed with tons of different things. I definitely recommend having a look at what the dialogue module does, because pretty much everything the dialogue module has is actually packed into this one component. So it's way too much for me to discuss right now. But it's incredibly cool. You can store your messages, your actions, conditions, everything related to the dialogue. So really cool stuff, really useful. Now, the other really incredibly useful component is the stats component. So I'm going to add that right now. And the stats component allows you to add stats to an object. Now, in many cases, you will add this to players and characters, but you don't actually need to do that. You can add stats to literally any game object in the world, and as long as it has it doesn't even have to have a collider either, but as long as you have a collider, you can also add the other components, which will actually possibly impact these stats as well. And basically, stats has the attributes you have set up, and in order to change these stats and attributes, you will have to go to the preferences window and go to stats to find all of them here, and your attributes and status effects. So yeah, the stats component is kind of like a thing you just need to add. You don't set up anything here. Yes, you can add some overrides, which is pretty cool. So you can have a override for vitality, which is tied to health. So health will always display as 100%, but instead of having 100 health, you can add 500 health for just the player, without having the need to create different stats for both player and enemy. So pretty cool stuff. But yeah, other than that, we have the save button, But stats is something that you don't set up here, you set it up in your preferences, and you need to add it to the objects in order to make sure that you can use them. Now, it's important that if you are using stats and you want to save these stats, that you don't duplicate them, but you add the stats component again to the object, because you know each one has its own ID. Now, for enemies, for example, this might not be necessary. You know, as long as you kill them, yeah, they're dead. But if you have multiple player characters with different attributes, you know, you want to avoid that. So that's the stats component, so really useful. Now from the, I will discuss UI components in a bit, as they're a bit of a different thing. We have the melee components. The character melee component is, again, something you need to add to a character or player in order for them to be able to use um, the melee module or shooter module. So it's, you need to add this. You don't need to set up any of these things except for you know, these values. You don't need to drag in a weapon. However, the cool thing is that you can also add hit reactions, you know, from a weapon if the player has the sword sheatheded. So really useful. I'm not sure this was always here. I don't remember it always being here, but I'm really happy this is here, because this way you can make sure that you still have hit reactions even if an enemy doesn't actually have his sword pulled out. So really, really cool stuff. Then we have the character shooter component, and we have the player shooter component. And basically they really have one difference, is that the player shooter has the what is it called, the targeter, you know, that little cross in your screen indicating where you know, you should be pointing at. The character shooter completely skips that, so it doesn't use that. If you want to have that, so mainly for the player, you need to make sure it's turned on. For example, for top down, it's something you could possibly turn off as well. But yeah, that's the main difference between these two. Again, this is needed if you want the player to be able to use the shooter module. So the actions for draw weapon, draw sword, if you don't have the component for melee or shooter, he won't do it. Pretty plain and simple. Now we have, you know, let's go to inventory, because I can't remember the name. Not inventory. Player equipment. There we go. So the player equipment is used for the inventory module, so I was in the right place. And player equipment allows the player to have access to the inventory module as well, so be able to use those things. Now, one big difference between this one and the character shooter or character melee component is that this will automatically be added in runtime by game creator. I would still recommend manually adding it, so you can actually toggle save equipment, and you know, just in case something would go wrong and it wouldn't be added in runtime. The reason you'll most likely not know that you even need to add this is because it gets added in runtime, but you want to be able to, you know, decide if you want to save these values, yes or no. So definitely add it manually yourself. And those are the most important ones when it comes to you know, player, melee, shooter. Now the triggers obviously get adjusted as well. So if you have a trigger, you can now use the trigger for being you know, receiving a shot, and etc, etc. We have a couple of other components as well. So game objects, and we can go to game creator, can go to traversal, and it doesn't show up here. No, that's not what I was looking for. So let me just simply drag in one of the prefabs, because I'm not familiar with the name that is being used. And there's a good reason for that as well. So game creator, traversal, prefabs, and I will drag one in and show you the components. So as you can see, we have our climbable scripts here. And this is a balance, this is a ladder, and it's all the same script. Now, the reason I choose to never manually add this component to anything is because honestly it's a bit too complex for me to just figure it out by myself without actually having a good lead example showing me what to do. So that's a personal thing, and you know, if you've used this so much you think I can do this myself, I don't need the prefabs as an indication. Perfect. I personally still do. I think I use it quite often, but apparently not often enough, and I can't really figure out how to do all of these things without still checking the prefabs. So yeah, that's you know, the reason I couldn't find it straight away like this is simply because, you know, I never added like this myself. So that's it for traversal. No, you don't need anything on the character in order to use this, which is one of the big differences with most of the other modules. You can simply go ahead and use it straight away as a player. So yeah, that's really cool. Then let's add another component, and this is an interesting one. It's called pool object. And why would you use this? Well, if you ever checked, for example, the arrow in the shooter module, you will see that it has this component added to it. And pool object basically means that if you instantiate a pooled object, you know, you can have a count and a duration, and then it will disappear and it will be out of the pool if you were. And you would use this with actions by using instantiate, and then you have instantiate and you have instantiate from pool. And yeah, so if you instantiate from pool, if I'm correct, and I could be wrong, this automatically gets added. Wouldn't count on it, so I just would do it myself, but that was my experience, or maybe I was just lucky and wrong. But those are basically the different use cases, so a pool automatically gets destroyed. And one of the downsides of this action compared to the other one is that you can't actually store it in a variable, which is something I always like to do. So yeah, keep that in mind when you use this. So yeah, incredibly useful component. And another really, you know, obviously important component is the behavior components. Behavior, there we go. And the behavior components and the behavior module in general consists of two parts. So we have the behavior and we have the perception. Now, behavior requires a behavior graph as well, which you can drag into this component. And you know, behavior is a whole set of different things, but it allows you to store a set of actions and conditions based in a order into a simple graph, which you can then drop onto a game object like a player and character, and they will behave according to what is set in that behavior graph. Simply put. Perception is something entirely different. Perception can be used to trigger things in behavior, but it's not necessarily needed with behavior at all, actually. In one of my projects, I, for example, use perception for something completely different on my player character, and he doesn't have a behavior graph as I control him myself. So yeah, you know, perception is not just limited to behavior use. And perception is literally kind of like, think of it as a trigger without it being an actual trigger. And you know, with perception you have a field of view, a cone, and you can make it 360 degrees as well. You can set the distance, you can set the masks, and the reason you would do this is because you can have triggers that are based on perception. So if we go to behavior, if invoker is in line of sight and the object perceiving, so the observer needs to have perception in order to see something in a line of sight, you can set a set of directions. So yeah, pretty cool. So really important. Then the last things we have left, and I'm pretty sure I missed something. You always do in the end. But the last set of things we have left are actually UI components for those modules. So we have MO UI, we have stats UI, we have attribute UI. Is there more? Status effect UI, quest UI. Quest UI and inventory UI and merchant UI, I would honestly recommend just checking the prefabs for that are included in the examples in order to make sure you use them properly. It's a bit hard to explain without actually building it all out, and the prefabs actually precisely show you how to use them. Now, what are these other ones? So MOUI is a component allowing you to literally display, combined with the shooter module, how much ammo you still have in a clip, and you just drag in the text objects that should be displaying this. Storage, max clip, name, description for the player, for the invoker, depending on who's using it. Stats UI, exactly the same thing, but then it does stats, and you do it per stat. So, for example, wisdom, you can set an icon, a color, a title, etc., the value. And attribute UI, which I've used in so many videos, which you'll be using in order to display stats like health and mana and stamina in a UI. So incredibly useful. I'm not going to go in all too much detail about what these actually do. Actually, I'm noticing this now. I'm pretty sure this is new since the last update as well, because I've used this so many times and I've never seen this before. So yeah, pretty cool. Anyway, yeah, these are incredibly useful. I've used them in so many videos, and again, I'd recommend actually checking out the examples if you have no idea how to use these. It's really hard to demonstrate the purpose of these without actually creating an entire UI around it, which I'm not going to do, but I've done in so many videos. And yeah, that's it. That's it for the basic components. Again, I might have missed some. I'm pretty sure I covered most. But that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.